Thank you, Paul, and I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers both for inviting me and for putting this subject on the agenda. Cyber is a subject that gets discussed increasingly commonly, but rarely this aspect of it, and I think it's very important. Cyber threats are a major challenge to governments around the world for a whole variety of reasons. But the one that I want to focus on is the fact that cyber threats don't fit into what I've taken to calling the traditional framework for dealing with security challenges. And by that I mean that law enforcement has traditionally taken care of domestic security threats, and the military being used to defend against threats from abroad. And I'm well aware there's some cultural differences in how these are managed and open to discussion about that, but I think this is true enough for almost all countries around the world that is the model that many aspire to. And the trouble with cyber is it often falls in the middle. Threats are from overseas, and yet they come at a level below which a military response is appropriate, and yet they often come from places where law enforcement partners are unwilling or unable to take serious action. And this is a fundamental challenge for governments in the 21st century. And I might also add, highly relevant to anyone interested in putting together a multinational security framework for dealing with those challenges going forward. To be more specific, then, I think there are essentially three ways in which governments can respond. They can improve international law enforcement, they can extend the role of the military, or they can think differently about how security is done. And I think actually you need all three of those, but my concern is often that governments default to number two, extending the role of the military. And that's what I want to discuss, and I welcome further discussion of later on today. Now, in order to talk about how government deals with these threats, as Paul suggested, I think it's quite important to at least to have an understanding, a common understanding of what we're talking about. And one of the most important things is breaking down what we mean by cyber threats. And there's no commonly agreed version of this, although there's beginning to emerge consensus. The taxonomy that I prefer is one that sort of derives from the work of a gentleman called Thomas Reid, who teaches at King's College London. So I've modified slightly. So you begin with cybercrime, which is a fairly self-explanatory term, crime through the internet. Not strictly speaking a national security threat, but at scale can cause big implications for the economy, which in turn has implications for national security. Then you have cyber espionage, spying through information systems, and then that breaks down potentially to commercial espionage and spying against national security apparatus. And those, again, can be split down in further ways. Third, you have what you might call cyber sabotage. And that's particularly directed at critical infrastructure, again, potentially below the level of what you would call an attack, at least in military terms. DDoS attacks against financial institutions, for example, might be included in that category. Fourth, you have what you might call cyber subversion, so releasing social security numbers onto the internet, undermining the faith in government's ability to look after your data. And then we come to cyber war, which strictly speaking in terms of physical damage from within cyberspace is very, very uncommon when you look at instances in the past. And finally, what I would like to add, which is the role of cyber capabilities within full spectrum operations, far more likely and far more worthy of our attention than perhaps it often gets. And although it's worth adding that it's not always clear on the part of the defender which of those threats they're on the receiving end of, I think that framework gives me a useful basis for discussing who should do what within governments. I mean, within that spectrum, I think it's worth pointing out there are undoubtedly times when the cyber capabilities of the military ought to be brought into use. I think three specific areas. First is to reinforce defense against extreme types of attacks on the critical national infrastructure, by which I mean national infrastructure on which society depends to continue to operate. For example, finance and banking, communication, transportation, energy. And I think it would be very odd if I was to argue that when a country was being attacked at a very high, in a very serious way, having an attack against their critical infrastructure, the military should stand back and say, we only go and fight wars overseas. Second, espionage against military systems, I think, is clearly a fundamental role for the military, potentially including the equipment that is going to be brought into service. It would again be odd if the military stood back and accepted that its system is going to be compromised before they were even built. Although I think it's also the case that over time it may well be the private sector to bear. And third, and this is often not given the attention it deserves, the protection of battlefield capability in the course of warfighting operations. But my main message today is I think we need to be careful how we use military capabilities beyond that. And the three particular reasons why I say that. Firstly is the real potential for crowding out. To have effective security at scale is beyond the capability of most militaries. The internet is already pervasive in most countries and becoming even more so. And that means that governments need to encourage their private sectors and civil sectors to step up and take greater responsibility for their own security. And the challenge is that if you make too many public statements about the role of the military in protecting your systems, the incentives for the private sector to do that is going to be that much less, and the overall security that you will have will be equally less. Second is the real potential for militarizing societies. Cyber threats are not going away. In fact, as we increasingly attach the internet to physical systems, the internet will have more of an impact on our lives. And as a result of that, if we accept that the military should be responsible for that security, you're bringing the military into areas that increasingly societies are pushing the military away from. And I think that's a significant challenge in this area. The very fact that the international reaction to Edward Snowden suggests that the world is not comfortable with militarizing cyberspace in that way. And third, it's worth remembering that the military have other work to do, not the least of which is preparing to protect their own systems, which in parallel with the increasing pervasiveness of the internet are affecting the way in which militaries fight their wars. And few, if any, militaries I know have properly protected all of their battlefield capability. And the more time they spend protecting private computers, arguably the less time they spend protecting their own equipment. So where does that leave us? I don't have time to discuss everything that could be done, but I think there's a real incentive to ensure the problem simply doesn't get placed at the feet of the military. Who else can pick this up? Well, I don't want to stray too far into the next panel, but there's clearly a possibility for increased international law enforcement. European Council of Europe's Convention on Cybercrime, for example. There's clearly a role for increased international cooperation in other ways. If you remember that the people who are responsible are people themselves. They live lives. There are opportunities to go after those people. Third, potential to improve support to the private sector, either by providing intelligence, but increasingly providing economic incentives for them to protect their own systems, and controversially in the United States, where I currently live, potential for regulation to force that in areas where the market arguably doesn't work. And fourth, to ensure that the military does indeed have the capacity to fight the wars that it's going to have to fight in this new environment. And I think, for me, most wars are going to be coalition wars. That really involves cooperating in preparation for those wars and exercising in coalitions that take account of how this might work in practice. So finally, let me say that, from my remarks, that I wouldn't want you to think that the military doesn't have a role in cyber. It absolutely does. But I also think it's important to take away the message that it's not only a military role. And it's equally important for other people in government to have that in the back of their minds, including potentially legislatures whose role it is to keep the military and the rest of government straight on these issues. And just to illustrate that point, let me leave you with one example from Great Britain, my own country, because, to paraphrase the American writer Mark Twain, history does not repeat itself, but it can rhyme. In the years between the two world wars, Britain pondered the emergence of a new domain of warfare, in this case the air, and in some ways came up with the visionary innovation of establishing a new military service, the Royal Air Force. And at one level it was very successful in that Britain was able to establish a fighter command which played a pivotal role in defending Britain against the possibility of a Nazi invasion, and by winning the Battle of Britain in 1940 kept the Second World War going on to its ultimately successful conclusion. However, a closer examination of the events of those periods show you that once the senior leaders in the RAF were given their own service, they did what many militaries do when they're confronted with difficult problems, and impose an offensive frame on the problem in order to make it more manageable and less complex. And the answer to that was to come up with a doctrine of strategic bombing, by which they would win a war by taking their opponents, in this case most likely Germany, out of the war. It was only by the intervention of civilian officials and legislators, including Winston Churchill, that they were forced to change to focus on what actually probably was the primary priority, and they were able to get fighter command in sufficient shape to win the Battle of Britain by 1940. There are a number of lessons there, but I think it helps frame some of the discussion. I look forward to discussing them with the distinguished panel in due course and listening to your questions as they come.